Welcome back. We're finishing the Wim Hof conversation with the cold, the mind, and this whole comfort trap. And honestly, the wildest part is how much of it is about mental control, not just ice water. He keeps acting like the body is just waiting for you to stop being dramatic. That is the most offensive thing and also maybe the most useful thing he says. Because the first thing he's saying is basically, you can train resilience instead of worshiping stress, which is a very rude message for modern life. But I do get why people latch onto it because it feels immediate. Like you breathe, you suffer, you settle, and suddenly your panic story looks smaller. He basically calls the cold a lie detector for your excuses. That is exactly why it works on so many people, because everybody has an excuse factory in their head. What hit you more, the breathing stuff or the ice bath part? The breathing, because it sounds almost too simple until you hear him talk about control. Although he does go full cosmic on it, like he's trying to unlock a hidden operating system. Yeah, he does not say reduce stress like a normal man. He says you can go deeper into the mind and override conditioning, which is a huge claim. But the practical version is pretty clean. You get calmer, sharper, and less reactive. And that's a much harder thing to argue with. Especially when he says the cold is just the proof, not the whole point. Because his real obsession is this idea of personal responsibility, right? Yes, and that's where it gets interesting because he frames victimhood as a learned habit. Which is blunt, but I can see why he says it. He thinks people have been conditioned to react instead of respond. Which sounds nice until your email inbox hits you like a truck. Exactly. The cold bath is easy compared to a Tuesday afternoon. But his point is that if you can regulate one hard thing, the rest starts to look possible. That domino effect idea is actually strong. Yeah, because the win is not the bath, it's the belief shift after the bath. You come out like, wait, maybe my whole life is not fixed at all. That's the actual product, not the ice. And then he ties that to this bigger criticism of comfort culture, which is where I think he's both right and a little theatrical. Because he's saying modern life drains energy through stress, rules, and constant noise. And that's true, but he makes it sound like civilization is one long weakness spiral. He would absolutely say yes and stare into your soul while doing it. But the counter-argument is fair too, because comfort is not the enemy by itself. The enemy is when comfort makes you fragile. That's why the discomfort movement makes sense to people now. Cold plunges, marathons, breath work, all of that is people trying to feel alive again. Which is hilarious because we invented air conditioning and then had to buy suffering back. That is the whole wellness economy in one sentence. The fasting part is another weirdly compelling one. He doesn't treat food like a ritual of anxiety, he treats it like timing and intuition. And that will make nutrition people furious, by the way. They're already drafting the angry posts. But his argument is basically that appetite is not always a command. It can be conditioned too. That part is actually important. Because if you start noticing that, then discipline stops feeling moral and starts feeling physical. And he's super consistent about that. Body, breath, mind, repeat. The man has basically built a lifestyle around refusing to be told what to do by discomfort. But I also think that's why people trust him, because he practices the thing he preaches. Even the early wake-ups, the exercise, the single daily meal, it all fits his story. Though waking up at 4:30 and acting cheerful is borderline suspicious. That is not human behavior. That is a sponsored species. The other huge thread is his idea that purpose is not some separate treasure hunt. He thinks purpose shows up when you're strong, happy, and healthy enough to serve something. Which is nice, but also suspiciously convenient coming from a guy with a mission already built in. He's definitely not confused about his own purpose. That part is very clear. But I think his deeper point is that purpose is not discovered in misery. It's something you can actually support with habits. That's why the cold matters to him, because it turns belief into something embodied. You don't just think you're capable, you feel it in real time. Which is the least convenient way to learn a lesson, so naturally humans love it. Of course we do. We need suffering to believe ourselves. The strongest part of his message to me is that people are more capable than they think. Especially people who feel trapped by work, school, family pressure, all of that. He's basically saying your story about yourself might be the cage. And that is a pretty brutal mirror. But it's also hopeful, because if the cage is partly yours, the key is too. That line would do numbers on a poster, by the way. Somebody's already making it into a grayscale Instagram slide. Still, there's something real in his whole counter-narrative. It's not that everyone needs ice baths forever. It's that people need evidence they can move their own state. Once you get that evidence, you stop outsourcing your power. And that's probably why the conversation lands so hard. It's not really about cold water. It's about whether you believe your body and mind can still be trained. And that feels like a good place to end the series. If there's one thing we keep circling back to, it's that resilience is teachable. Not perfect, not magical, just teachable. And possibly very uncomfortable along the way. But that's the point, right? Welcome back. This one is about cold exposure, mind training, and the weird myth of comfort. And it gets interesting when the whole thing stops being about ice and starts being about control. He really believes the mind can be trained like a muscle, which is a wild claim. Wild, but also annoyingly persuasive when somebody is sitting in a tub of ice smiling. The first thing that jumps out is that he thinks breathing can change stress resilience fast. Better than mindfulness and meditation, he says, which is a massive statement. That is not a casual sentence to drop into a podcast. No, he basically walked in and said, I have a better tool than the wellness industry. But the deeper argument is that people are overwhelmed because they've lost access to themselves. He keeps coming back to this idea of interoception, knowing what's happening inside the body. That part actually matters, because most people only notice the body when it starts failing. And then suddenly they're like, wait, why is my chest tight? Why am I panicking? Why am I numb? His whole method is basically a shortcut back into that internal awareness. Or a very dramatic shortcut if the shortcut involves ice water and hyperventilating on purpose. Yeah, not exactly a spa day with a scented candle. What I found most provocative is his hatred of passive victimhood. He thinks people have been trained to feel helpless, and that helplessness becomes identity. That can sound empowering, but it can also sound like he's blaming people for being stressed. Yeah, and I think that's where the nuance matters, because trauma is real, conditioning is real. He's not saying pain is fake, he's saying the response to pain can be retrained. And the ice bath becomes this proof of concept for that claim. Right, because the moment the panic rises, the mind tells you to flee. Then you stay, and a few minutes later your body says, oh, I guess we're fine. The body is basically an overdramatic employee who needs better management. It sends a full emergency memo, and then 20 seconds later, it's like, never mind. That's why the cold is so clever as a tool. It compresses the entire drama of fear into a few seconds. And if you survive that, the rest of life can start to feel negotiable. But do you buy his bigger claim that this spills into everything else? I actually do, at least psychologically, because once you trust yourself in one extreme, you trust yourself more broadly. That's the cascade he keeps talking about, right? Exactly. One win becomes evidence, and evidence becomes identity. And identity is basically the most expensive thing we all keep buying. Oh, that is good, because he's also attacking consumer comfort as a trap. He thinks modern life is too insulated, too padded, too easy on the body, and too hard on the spirit. That's why the cold movement, the marathon movement, all of that looks like rebellion. Not rebellion for its own sake, but a way to feel alive again. Which is ironic because the rebellion is literally making yourself miserable voluntarily. Human beings are hilarious when you think about it. But he'd say it's not misery, it's calibration. And that's the better word, honestly, because he's not glorifying suffering. He's glorifying the ability to choose discomfort without collapsing. That's a very different philosophy from just toughing things out. The fasting piece fits there too, because it's another way of saying, I'm not ruled by impulse. And he's weirdly consistent about it, like he trusts intuition over instruction, even when the instruction is basically every nutrition campaign ever. Breakfast propaganda took a hit today. The breakfast lobby is devastated. But his point is simpler than the internet makes it. Eat when your body wants to eat. Which is not a crazy idea, just a less marketable one. Less marketable is the whole theme of this conversation. Right, because the message is always buried under systems that make people dependent. Work schedules, stress, consumption, distraction, all of it pulling energy outward. And he keeps reframing purpose as health plus happiness plus strength. Which is almost offensively simple. It's so simple it makes every self-help book blush. But maybe that's why it lands, because he refuses to separate purpose from physiology. He's basically saying if your body is wrecked, your philosophy gets warped. And if your nervous system is constantly in panic, your decisions shrink. That part feels huge because it turns spirituality into something embodied. Not floating above life, but sitting inside it with a steadier hand. The funniest contradiction is that he talks like a guru, but also like a drill sergeant. He absolutely does, and somehow the mix works. Maybe because he's selling confidence through repetition, not just charisma. And because he seems to believe what he's saying down to the bone. That conviction is probably why people respond so strongly to him. He's not asking for belief first, he's asking for participation first. Which is fair, but also dangerous if people skip the judgment part. Totally. And that's where any method like this needs boundaries. Still, as a message, it's compelling. You are not as fragile as you think. And maybe fragility has been overlearned in a world that rewards comfort. That's the tension this whole episode lives in. The final takeaway is not go freeze yourself, which feels important. Very important correction. It's that resilience can be practiced, and the body is part of the practice. And once you see that, the cold stops being the headline. It becomes a mirror. That's a good place to leave the series, honestly. We started with a man in ice water and ended with a question about how trained we are. And whether that training can be reversed, reworked, or rebuilt. Spoiler, he would say yes, loudly, and probably while yelling from a tub. Which, to be fair, is a memorable sales strategy. Thanks for sticking with us through the whole series. And if this conversation did anything, I hope it made comfort look a little less sacred. Welcome back. We are ending with the wildest claim of all. The mind can be trained like a muscle. And the whole argument is that comfort has made us softer, not safer. Which is a rude thing to say right before an ice bath, honestly. But that is the tension here, because he is not just talking about cold water. He is talking about stress, trauma, attention, and whether people can actually recondition themselves. And he keeps saying the cold is just the doorway, not the destination. Which is a very motivational way to describe suffering. Yeah, but his point is not even suffering for drama. It is deliberate discomfort as evidence that your panic is not always reality. That first 20 seconds in the ice bath is the whole movie, right? The body says escape, the mind says obey, and then suddenly you realize nothing is actually killing you. That is such a human lesson because we do that everywhere. We hit resistance and immediately call it a wall, a limit, a fact. And his argument is that a lot of those walls are just inherited fear, or learned helplessness dressed up as personality. Imagine blaming your whole life on being a cold person when maybe you just never stayed in the water long enough. That is actually the most provocative part, because he is saying resilience is trainable. Not as a vibe, not as a slogan, but as a bodily skill. And he thinks breathing is the first layer of that skill. Deeper breathing, deeper mechanisms, deeper access to the body. He almost makes it sound like your nervous system is this locked room he found the keys to. And he is absolutely the kind of guy who would say that with zero irony. But then the studies come in, and that is where it gets interesting. He is basically saying the method outperformed mindfulness and meditation in stress resilience. That is a huge claim, and I can already hear every wellness person sitting up straight. Someone in linen just dropped their matcha. But the larger point is that he wants active regulation, not passive coping. He keeps returning to command, responsibility, and the ability to respond. That is why he gets so intense about victimhood. He thinks victimhood is what happens when people stop believing they can influence their own state. I get the appeal, but that can sound a little too clean if you have real trauma. True, and that is where I think the conversation becomes more complicated. Because he is not saying pain is fake, he is saying your relationship to pain can be trained. And that distinction matters a lot. It also explains why he keeps making it feel almost philosophical. The man turns a freezing tub into a lecture on human freedom. He really does connect discomfort to purpose and purpose to emotional regulation. That is why he says the goal is not extreme suffering. The goal is being able to stay with yourself when life gets hard, which is a lot less sexy than saying, go jump in ice water and become a superhero, but way more usable, to be fair. The fasting part was also revealing, because it was not performance for him. It was instinct, routine, and a kind of body trust. Though I still think the average person hearing that will just think, this guy is built different. He absolutely is built different, and then he insists you can copy him. That tension is doing a lot of work in the interview. Because part of his message is personal exceptionalism, and part of it is universal accessibility. He wants to be both the outlier and the proof. And maybe that is why people respond to him so strongly. He is not selling optimization, he is selling permission. Permission to feel stronger than your fear. Permission to question the schedule that told you 3 meals a day was sacred. Permission to annoy every nutritionist in the room. But he is also pushing against this modern idea that more comfort automatically means more progress. And that is one of the biggest themes of the whole series. We built a life that avoids friction and then act surprised when people feel weak. That is the uncomfortable mirror here. Comfort is great until it starts raising you badly. That should be on a t-shirt, annoyingly. And the final piece that stuck with me is his obsession with energy. Not just calories or sleep, but emotional and mental energy. He thinks modern life drains people into obedience and numbness, which is dramatic, but not crazy if you look at how people live. Always overstimulated, always tired, always halfway elsewhere. And his answer is not escape, it is training. Train the breath, train the mind, train the response, train the body. It is a very old school answer in a very modern package. Basically, become hard to shake and keep going. I think that is why this episode lands as a finale. It is not just about one man in ice water. It is about whether we still believe human beings can be remade. And whether that remaking starts with something as small as a breath. That is the whole series for us, really. Breath, cold, and a fight against surrender. Thanks for riding through all 3 episodes with us. If this series did anything, I hope it made comfort look less automatic. And maybe made agency feel a little more real. We will leave the ice where it belongs now. Until next time, stay curious, stay sharp, and do not trust every wall you meet. Welcome back. We're finishing on the mind, the cold, and this obsession with comfort. And honestly, the wild part is how much of it comes down to who gets to control the story inside your head. That is what he kept circling back to, right? Not just tolerance, but command. Which is a very intense word to use about sitting in freezing water. It sounds like battle language for a bath. But his point is that the body is not just something that happens to you. He treats it like a place where training can change the whole operating system. That's the line that gets people because it sounds almost too neat. Like breathe harder and suddenly your life app updates itself. Exactly. But then you hear him talk about stress resilience and cognitive awareness going up. And you go, wait. The interesting claim is not magic. It is that repeated discomfort can reveal stuff you were hiding from. That first 20 seconds in the ice bath sounded like the real test. Not the 5 minutes later when the body adapts, but the moment panic says run. That is such a human moment, though, because we all have that freeze before the freeze. And he's basically saying the wall is often self-authored. Which is empowering, but also annoying because now the wall is partly your fault. That is the worst kind of self-help, honestly. But I think that is why the message lands for so many people. It does not ask you to understand yourself perfectly first. It asks you to do the thing, survive it, and then notice what changed. Very rude, very effective. And he keeps connecting that to responsibility, which is a much more loaded word than discipline. Responsibility means response, not blame. That distinction matters because he is not saying victims are fake. He is saying you still deserve a way back to agency. And maybe that is why he gets so intense about teaching kids early. He wants this to be normal before the fear becomes identity. That part I get, but I also hear the danger of turning every discomfort into a life lesson. Yeah, because then you start romanticizing suffering like it is some universal upgrade. Cold shower, enlightenment, breakfast of champions. Exactly. And he would probably say, no, do not worship the suffering. He keeps saying the goal is happiness, strength, and health. Which is actually more radical than sounding hardcore all day. Because if you can be calm, powerful, and useful, that ruins a lot of modern marketing. Dude, yes, because half the economy depends on you feeling incomplete. His whole thing is basically a rebellion against depletion. Breath, cold, fasting, movement, all of it feels like reclaiming battery life. I love that he casually says he eats once a day like it is a coffee preference. Right, and then he says maybe breakfast is nice, but he just likes feeling a little empty. That is where you feel the difference between rule following and lived intuition. He is not trying to universalize a diet plan so much as prove he can feel his own signals. Still, if someone copied his routine without his temperament, they might just become miserable and cold. A very icy little disaster. That is why I think the better takeaway is not the extreme version. It is the principle that comfort is not always the same as well-being. Sometimes convenience makes you weaker, not safer. That is the sentence this whole episode keeps forcing on you. And then he goes bigger and says society drains energy on purpose, almost like theft. That's where I start pushing back a little because it can sound conspiratorial fast. But if you soften the language, the feeling is recognizable. People really do walk around overstimulated, overcommitted, and undercharged. And when your energy is low, your choices get smaller, your patience gets thinner. Then your life starts to feel like a series of reactions. That is the deeper claim here, that reactivity is a prison. And calm is not softness, it is capacity. He even ties it to purpose, which I thought was interesting. Not purpose as a career title, but purpose as alignment. So the answer to existential panic is apparently do push-ups and stop eating lunch. That is one terrifying life coach sentence. But there is something oddly clean about his logic. If the body is calmer, the mind is clearer, and the clearer mind can choose better. Then the whole hierarchy starts to shift. What did you think about the work-life balance answer? He basically rejected the phrase like it was a boring office joke. He really did. He said, my work is my mission, not my job. And that is beautiful if your mission is real, but dangerous if it becomes self-mythology. Because some people use mission talk to avoid rest, family, and actual limits. Exactly, the language of purpose can hide burnout very elegantly. Still, I get why he lives there, because his whole identity is built around service. He really believes he is spreading something useful. And in fairness, a lot of people listening are not looking for perfection. They are looking for a lever. They want one thing they can actually do when life gets heavy. Breathe, get uncomfortable, and prove to yourself you are not stuck. That is his whole gospel in one sentence. And the reason it works as a finale is because it leaves us with a choice. Do we keep treating fragility like identity, or treat it like training data? That is the question underneath everything here. So if this series did anything, it made the wall look a little less permanent. And maybe the cold look a little less like punishment and a little more like a mirror. A very rude mirror, but still a mirror. Exactly, and that is us wrapped on the trilogy. Thanks for staying with us through the breath, the ice, and all the chaos in between. If you listened from episode 1, we hope you leave with a little more agency. If you joined us here, go back and let the whole arc hit you in order. And until the next one, stay curious, stay sharp, and do not trust every wall you meet.